Is the RAM crisis finally over? That's a question that I certainly had, and I'm sure plenty of you had when you saw headlines like this one over at Tom's Hardware. Memory prices surge begins to cool as consumers hit affordability limit. And you see something like that and you think, is the RAM crisis over? And if you continue reading the rest of the headline, which I didn't originally do, you can see that no, the RAM crisis is far from over. As this report that from TrendForce that the Tom's Hardware article was talking about, basically prices have still gone up by 13 to 18% for DRAM, and that's compared with 60% increases over the previous quarter. So yes, prices are slowing, but no, they are not going back down, which is a really massive shame because as hopefully a lot of you will know, well, I guess hopefully, not hopefully, because the RAM crisis is terrible, but as I'm sure a lot of you will know, the RAM crisis is this thing that we're seeing across the entirety of the tech world in consumer tech where prices are going up. You've got things like Apple seeing major price hikes on its Macs and iPads. Valve hiked the price of the Steam Deck by loads in various regions. We're seeing PS5 and PS5 Pro price increases, and we're even getting warnings that future and upcoming phone devices and various other things are getting a price hike. And a big thing for a lot of these hikes is the technology isn't getting any better. Obviously, new tech getting price rises is sort of expected at times, and you can maybe anticipate that, though sometimes we're seeing way bigger price hikes than we'd normally expect to see. But what we're also seeing are price increases for old gadgets that should theoretically be going down in price over time, not up. And I think a big question you should also start with near the top of this video is what the heck is RAM? And if you Google this, you will find plenty of places that use the exact same analogy that I'm about to use, but it's really good, so I'm just going to straight up steal it. So you can imagine your hard drive or your SSD as your fridge, your pantry, your freezer, places where you're going to put all of your food in long-term storage. And then when you need it, as a chef, which is you or your CPU, it's going to pull out those ingredients that it thinks it needs, and it's going to load them onto the kitchen counter, which is your RAM. This way, it's super easy to access your ingredients. You don't need to go and look for them. You just know, okay, there's my carrots, there's my broccoli, there's my chicken, and you can just do whatever you need with it. And then when you are processing it, that is when you put it into your frying pan. That's your cache. That's when you're manipulating that data. And it's basically part of your computer's memory system. And if you're thinking of computers having a memory, having sort of thought, thinking, trying to make their way through different processes, you might be thinking of one very important two-letter word that has taken over the tech space. And that is, of course, AI. And basically what is happening is classic supply and demand. Because of AI, there has been a massive demand increase in AI. We're seeing that various spending experts are expecting AI spend to go up by 47% this year to a total of $2.59 trillion, which is absolutely massive. And so much of that is devoted to AI infrastructure, which includes data centers, which is where all of these components and RAM are being fed into. And because of that, data centers are consuming 70% of the whole world's memory chip supply this year, at least it's expected to, which is a massive, massive thing. Because it's not just AI companies that need this. Obviously, all the phone companies, computing companies, game console companies, everyone in the consumer tech space, even like TVs that are smart TVs need RAM. Everybody needs it. And if you've gone from AI taking up a relatively small percentage of that to suddenly 70%, that last 30% is being fought over way more vigorously by all these companies. They're willing to pay more so that they can get the RAM that they need to be able to create the devices that we really want. Otherwise, they're not going to have enough iPhones or PS5s that we are going to want. And then another factor that we've got to consider is normally not only is there more demand, but there's less supply, because basically chip manufacturers will sell off their old equipment to places like China, who will then make cheaper, more affordable RAM and computing components. But because of all these US trade and tariff disagreements that have been going on the past few years, a lot of these companies were worried that by buddying up to China, even in this very small way, they could see some kind of backlash. So basically they went, no, we're not sending you all of our old equipment. And that means that there is a lack of supply as well, and not just a massive increase in demand. Which leads to a RAM price graph that looks like this. You can see across 2024, prices were sort of trending very steadily down, but in that 100 to 150 range. And then right at the end of 2025, because of massive increases in need for RAM from AI companies, they have gone well above $400. So The next big question that I'm sure you're all having is, when will this be over? When can I go out and get very cheap technology again? Well, if you listen to people like Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang, he says it's going to be quite a few more years, and various phone manufacturers are saying, look, prices aren't just going to stay high at the moment, they're going to keep going up, which is absolutely not what you want to hear. But then you do have a few people that are giving a more positive spin on things. People are saying that, by 2028, demand might fall a little bit. Samsung, SK Hynix, and others are looking to spend billions on building more RAM fabrication capacity so they can produce more, give more supply to this. And also, an ex-Samsung boss expects that we might even see things dip off in 2027, which is only a year away, even if that feels like a long year and a half away. And another factor could be if you think the AI bubble, pictured here, very cool, will eventually pop. Because obviously, if there is not as much AI demand for RAM, then it's not going to be eating up that, and people can get back to their more affordable computing components. Unfortunately, there are just a lot of unknowns in this whole situation. On the one hand, Jensen Huang and people trying to sell you components and expensive hardware are going to want you to think that the RAM crisis might last quite a while, because when companies are looking to book space on fabrication machines, they're not, looking at a month's time. They're sometimes booking this years in advance. And if they think like, oh, okay, the RAM crisis is going to be over in a couple of years, I don't want to book it all at a really high price, or I might want to try and actually negotiate the price down. Instead, these companies want you to think it's still going to be really, really hard to get RAM, and they want you to pay more for the privilege of making it. And companies that have made expensive hardware want you thinking, okay, prices are still going to go up, so you might as well buy now before prices rise further, rather than you not buying their expensive phones and only coming back when their phones are slightly cheaper. At the same time, more supply doesn't necessarily mean that everyone will get hold of the chips they want. Obviously, AI is continuing to boom, and while people keep predicting this bubble, as they call it, will pop, it's not really happened yet. And so there's a possible chance that these companies just basically continue to eat up the supply, even if it does increase. And because Nvidia is such a massive part of the US stock market, if there is this potential threat that comes from cheap, more affordable RAM prices and component prices down the line, it wouldn't be outside the realm of possibility for trade restrictions or tariffs to come back in to keep prices artificially high to protect Nvidia's value. I'm not saying that will happen, but it could potentially happen, again, leading to the fact that we just do not know what's going to go on. And finally, I think one additional point I should mention, I'm not going to go too deep into it here. I want to keep this as a more approachable overview of the whole situation and what's going on. But basically, there are architectural differences between the typical consumer components that you and I want in our laptops and phones, and the sort of AI or enterprise level parts that are in really high demand right now. And basically, if fabs are dedicated to making those non-consumer parts, even if there is a lack of demand for them, there'll be an overinflux of supply of that stuff, and that won't necessarily help you and I out straight away. So even if things do start to improve by the end of 2027 or 2028, we might not see prices drop quite so quickly, as it will take time for proper consumer supply to come in. Now, I don't want to end this video on a massive buzzkill about how prices are going to be super high forever, so I'm going to give a bit of a silver lining, because while we don't know if the RAM crisis will end by next year, or even if it will end in 2030, or some point beyond that, we know that from history, prices do eventually come down, shortages do end. Obviously, many of us will remember the COVID era chip shortage, where all of us were after more consumer tech because we were stuck at home and our world went digital and online. That brought up demand, and then that did dip, even if very briefly, before the AI shortage came in. Back in 2011, we saw a component shortage. If you remember that massive 9.0 rated earthquake that struck Japan, it took out one of the world's biggest producers of silicon wafers, which are a key part in computing components. And so that meant that there was a brief shortage because of that. The 2004 chip shortage came about when mobile phones all wanted this exact same type of communication chip called a CDMA chip that was meant to improve network connectivity. And there was a massive demand for those, and eventually eventually that died down. Back in 2000, because of sort of poor component demand forecasting by the likes of Intel and AMD, there was a lack of components that led to some price increases and a shortage. In 1995, there was a chip shortage caused by a personal computing boom, thanks to the advancements in the computing world, like the public launch of the World Wide Web, and also because new hardware was hitting the scene and there wasn't enough of that. And all the way back in 1986, when a trade pact that was meant to help American train makers keep up with the then dominant Japanese-led market, basically all these Japanese manufacturers stopped making chips, and then American companies that were worried that the market might not be as safe and reliable as they originally thought basically went, yeah, we're not going to re-enter. And so there was a lack of supply from Japan and still an incredible demand. And so yes, while we do not know what's going to happen in the RAM world, we've seen before that these crises have appeared and then eventually disappeared, because that's the world of capitalism. You know, if there's a space for supply and there's possibility for some company to try and make mega bucks because of a demand for something, everyone's going to try and swoop in, supply will rise, it will catch up, eventually overtake, and then we'll see the reverse impact of supply demand. We will see prices finally drop, and I'm sure that will come, even if we don't know exactly when. So thank you so much for watching. I've been Hamish Hector, and I will hopefully see you in another video in the future. We'll see if I can keep this up.